It's an enormous pleasure for me to welcome everybody here on the occasion of the Geoffrey Rickman Memorial Lecture, and that is Geoffrey Rickman in his early days when he was a scholar at the British School at Rome. Geoffrey Rickman passed away in February 2010. He was a remarkable scholar and an enormous friend of the British School at Rome. In 2002, when Geoffrey retired as chairman of the Council of the British School at Rome, which is also his 70th birthday, and the formal inauguration of this lecture theatre in which we're sitting, Geoffrey Rickman gave a speech in the dining room of the British School at Rome, which nobody who was there will ever forget, in which he declared, "I have been a very lucky man. I have loved 2 institutions and 1 woman in my life, and it has been my good fortune to have spent most of my life with all 3, the University of St Andrews, the British School at Rome, and my wife Anna." And Anna sends her best wishes for this evening. As the person who, in no sense replaced, but at least followed Geoffrey Rickman into the University of St Andrews Department of Ancient History, I feel a close connection with somebody who was, for me, a very great friend. Geoffrey came to the BSR in 1958 with a Henry Francis Pelham studentship from Oxford. It took him 36 hours by boat, train and bus. Some of you will recall, and others will tell those of you who don't, Geoffrey's remarkable story of his trunk, which remained in the foyer of the British School at Rome for an embarrassingly long period of time before it was taken to his room. Geoffrey immediately became a wonderfully active scholar of the British School at Rome, with his work at Ostia, on ports and on Roman granaries. His 2 great books, Roman Granaries and Corn Supply of the Ancient in the Ancient World, justly earned him a fellowship at the British Academy and great praise for his scholarly acumen, and a profound commitment to trying to understand the way in which the world actually worked. And he was immensely interested in understanding the mechanics of life of antiquity. There are many, many stories about Geoffrey. He was a raconteur, a friend, and an extraordinarily gifted administrator. And in closing my words on Geoffrey, I would just like to say that those of us who have benefited from the major extension work that was done the end of the last century, the beginning of this century, in the library, the lecture theatre and various other parts of the BSR, know that Geoffrey steered the British School at Rome through a very difficult project with great calmness, huge sense of humour and an immense passion for what we do here at the British School at Rome. And so it was a great pleasure to be able to found a annual lecture in honour of Geoffrey Rickman, and many distinguished scholars have stood at this podium remembering Geoffrey's work and presenting their own, but none more distinguished than our current lecturer, Professor Nicholas Purcell, the Camden Professor of Roman History at the University of Oxford. Nicholas was used his Craven Fellowship from the University of Oxford in 1978 to come to the British School at Rome, where he was here at the same time as another one of our guests here at the moment, John Osborne, who was a Rome scholar. He came back to the BSR as last fellow in 2003-04, and over many years Nicholas has been a tremendous contributor to the work of the British School at Rome, with stints working on the pages of the British School at Rome, and of course his remarkable work pulling together Martin Fredrickson's remarkable book on Campania, which remains one of our most sought after publications. Nicholas's own work is so varied and so important that if I were to start talking about it now, he would have no time for his lecture, so I have no intention of doing that. But it is probably no exaggeration to say that there are few books which have made such an impression on the way we think about the Mediterranean world, as his co-authored book with Peregrine Horden, A Corrupting Sea, which has really reshaped our discourse and to some extent our language in talking about a world which Geoffrey Rickman himself found so fascinating. So it's a very great pleasure, also a great personal pleasure for me, since many, many years ago, Nicholas Purcell was on the committee which gave me a Craven Award, which brought me for the very first time to the British School at Rome. So I feel many circles are being hooped and closed this evening. So with no further ado, I'd like to ask you all to welcome Nicholas, who will speak to us on taking a tenth, offerings, profits, taxes and display in the Roman Republican economy. And there is a handout which I hope everybody has got access to. Thank you very much indeed, Nicholas.
Just a slight pause while I get my text back. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and Chris, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, your very gracious words. I'm chair of the Craven Committee again. So I like to think that we might be giving a Craven Award to somebody as distinguished as you, who will make similar remarks about people in the years to come. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that I should apologize to our Italian audience members for the fact that I shall speak in English this evening, but I shall try to speak relatively slowly and with a certain degree of emphasis so as to make myself comprehensible, at least as far as language is concerned. It's, of course, a rather melancholy pleasure to be invited to give the Rickman lecture. It's certainly always a great treat to be invited to the BSR and to give a public lecture again here. And I'm most grateful to the school for the invitation and all its hospitality. But I was very fond of Geoffrey Rickman, and it's sad to have to commemorate an absent and much lamented friend who could, just on grounds of age, very well have been still with us today. I could reminisce at some length about him, starting with swimming together from the North Sands at St. Andrews when I was there as external examiner, and I would certainly include in a list of Rickman anecdotes the dramatic occasion when he and I accepted a lift in an ambulance taking a non-emergency invalid from this building to Fiumicino. Nobody told the ambulance crew that it was not an emergency. The lights and siren went on when we reached the Via Belle Arti, and straight through the Piazza Venezia and the Lago Argentina we went during the afternoon rush hour, picking up a police escort to reach Fiumicino in 27 minutes flat. The sick lady was rather worse by the time we arrived. And even Geoffrey was completely uncharacteristically at a complete loss for words. My lecture today, and I apologize for using a slightly different title from the one on the handout, from the one which you're expecting from the handout. The handout has a different title from the one you're expecting from the flyer for the lecture. My lecture begins with an inscription which was published only 4 years ago, but which would have interested Geoffrey greatly. It's a singularly rich document with many different implications. For me, it has a special resonance as a starting point for a lecture here in the BSR, as one of those areas which it illustrates is that amazing cluster of intractable problems which is the Forum Boarium. And it's coming up to 39 years, as Chris said, since I found myself as a graduate student here at the same time as Mary Beard, getting interested, as she did at the same time, in the cults and temples of that perplexing place. Martin Fredrickson, another much-missed friend, introduced the two of us to Filippo Coarelli, and we therefore had a sneak preview of some of the ideas which emerged 10 years later in his brilliant study, Il Foro Boario. So I can hardly not start with some very tentative remarks about what light our new text can shed on these old controversies. But I am at least an experienced enough amateur of Roman topography to know that these very points arising from this very inscription will have been much discussed in the scholarly life of this city over the last 4 years, though I haven't seen any of the conclusions of such conversations. I've no doubt I will hear more from you. But in fact, the main purpose of this paper is historical rather than topographical, and I want to broaden the reflection in the direction of the changing fiscal, economic, and social nature of the Roman polity from the 4th century BC to the date of the new text, to which we should then now turn. I've given you a transcription of the surviving right-hand side of the inscription on the handout. What survives is clear, well-preserved, and unambiguous. The length of what is missing, which varies according to the letter sizes, may be roughly gauged if you want to play the game of reconstructing the text for yourselves, for our purposes this evening, from the certain supplements which I have included on the handout. What you have in front of you is a family history success story. This inscription records the honouring of a Flavian imperial freedman who beautifully instantiates social promotion across the generations. Our man, who is called something Eros, Nick Eros might be the easiest, most frequently attested slave name ending in Eros, which fits the symmetrical layout of the letters, is honoured as the father of Titus Flavius Irenaeus, duumvir of the Colonia of Formiae and its patron, and the grandfather of something Ianus and Severianus, the children, one supposes, of Irenaeus, who have reached the rank of Equites Romani and are also now patrons of the city of Formiae. It's reasonable to suppose that Irenaeus was an Eques himself. To date this heartwarming saga of upward social mobility, we need to turn to the city on the coast of Latium, of Lazio, where the inscription was found, the city of which this family were patrons. Formiae, heart of one of the most celebrated landscapes of Roman villeggiatura, where Cicero was murdered and where Aelius Lamia reminded Horace of the legend of the Laestrygonians. Formiae had been a municipium with a rather individual set of institutions, of which the most striking is that alongside their Augustales, there was a junior cadre, perhaps of freedmen who were only informally manumitted, that is, Junian Latins, who bore the strange name of regales, of ex-kings, after a probably priestly office in the town, and formed an order of ex-kings, an ordo regalium. It is they who set up this commemoration. But the city's status changed, and it became, grandly, Colonia Aelia Hadriana Augusta Formiae. We have no way of knowing exactly when Hadrian promoted the city, as he promoted Aeclanum, which is also on the Appia corridor, though it was probably during his periods of residence in Italy, 125 to 7 or 132 to 8. After his visit to Africa of 128, Hadrian immediately set out for Athens and the East, and it's attractive to think of the princeps undertaking his own iter Brundisinum and ennobling or otherwise rewarding the cities in which he stayed. So Colonia Formiae is probably no older than 125 of our era. The city of Formiae, then, was upwardly mobile too, and in the next reign secured a major benefaction, of a kind which has some relevance to this inscription. It acquired a new port, no doubt one among the set of refuge harbours for annonal grain ships, with which the coasts of South Italy were little by little equipped during the early empire. Freed by a Flavian emperor, our man Eros is, on comparative evidence, still not very likely to have reached manumission before the legal age of 30, even if he had, as is likely, started as a younger age the service which was to distinguish him. And if he was lucky enough to anticipate, it's probably not much more than a few months, according to the experts on freedman promotion patterns. He is very likely, then, to have been born before AD 67, and can hardly have been, on my hypothesis, much younger than 58 when Formiae became a colonia. His son, born, since he is ingenuous, after the father's manumission, had sons of his own, as you've heard. Their equestrian status probably involves a beneficium from the emperor, and it's most likely to have been associated with the award of an equestrian post. If our man was freed as late as possible, and Irenaeus born in 96, the children, born, say, when he was 25, could hardly have attained such office until the very end of Hadrian's reign, when the honorant himself was at least 70. So we acquire a window for this inscription of the 10 or 15 years which follow AD 125. It's time to turn to the individual items, which are listed as the honourable employments of our subject. I shall go through them one by one before we inquire what, if anything, they have to do with one another. Is it a career? What so recommended something arose to the locals of Formiae? Despite the lacunae, maddening in this case as so often, at least 3 duties are discernible, and it's at once apparent that we are firmly in the territory of the corn supply of ancient Rome. In particular, we are here in the area of that curious but fascinating integration of institutional planning and individual profit-seeking, public and private, fiscal and economic domains in the universe of the annona, which was such an important subject of Geoffrey's research, and one of the most important elucidations which he made in that great work. My aim today is to try to go further in inserting that overlap, that grey area, that fuzzy transition, that rejection of neat and binary classification into some larger historical contexts. So the first post in this sequence refers to the finance department responsible for the annona. Rickman calls it an independent accounts office for the grain supply, the Fiscus Frumentarius. Already in 1905, Hirschfeld observed that inscriptions of the Fiscus Frumentarius are found from around the Flavian period to at least the mid-2nd century, which fits the present text exactly. To judge from the parallels, the most likely reconstruction here to fit the lacuna is the word dispensator. The role of cashier or disbursement official is not a very senior position, but it's in any case hard to reconstruct this text as a career in any meaningful sense, up or down. However, we should take it from the engagement of our subject with the state purchase of cereals and other necessary materials for the annona and similar purposes. We should take from it that engagement. This division, then, was a necessary complement to the entirely public parts of the annonal system. But even where the grain was received as taxation in kind, it was moved by private ship owners and merchants, and they must have been among the most prominent clients of the Fiscus Frumentarius. The second fragmentary phrase gives us a group of people, of men who come from Africa. Who are they? Nothing in the remaining epigraphy of the Fiscus Frumentarius encourage us to take the phrase of this line to qualify the function of dispensator. One could, however, imagine that such an official might specialize in the work of the shippers from ports in Africa Proconsularis, noting the Ostian dedication, which you got on the handout, to Antoninus Pius as a sort of parallel of masters of ships from Carthage in Africa, Domini Navium Carthaginiensium ex Africa. And the word sea captains, navicularior, would just about fit the gap. But if we are to take dispensator in the most literal sense, rather than simply as administrator or manager, then why are those people in the genitive? He should be making payments to them. And finally, what are they up to? The word urbe could belong in the next employment to be listed, but it needs et in or something first, which leaves little space for completing the clause. So I turn to that line. On that view, however, it is in the city of Rome, urbe, that the next duties listed are to be found. They, by contrast, concern a group of consumers of annonal grain. The pistores magnarii are also rather characteristic figures of this historical moment. Bakers in bulk, they received recognition as a collegium, an official status, a generous privilege in relation to their citizen status, and perhaps the actual name magnarii from a measure of Trajan, which we know was delivered in a letter to the prefect of the corn supply, Sulpicius Similis, in 106-7. That's the man who, according to the historian Cassius Dio, was famous for saying that he only began to live when he retired. Trajan ruled that Latin citizens producing more than 100 modii, about 900 litres, of bread each day for 3 years in the city of Rome should get the full right of the citizenship optimo iure. And I note in passing that if we were to use Geoffrey's figures for the grain consumed by Rome each year, it would require some 1,100 bakers working at that capacity to bake all of Rome's bread in the course of a year. What we can't precisely tell from what's left of the text is what Eros's office was in relation to these new-style bakers. I've put a few of the relevant texts on the handout. Maybe he was praepositus, but it's hard to see how to reconstruct the verb ending in unt. It would, after all, be ambitious but interesting to make this the missing verb for the men from Africa, and to see the responsibility as specifically for the importation of African wheat for the use of the pistores magnarii. But that seems a rather chatty description of a responsibility. But it's an intermittently chatty inscription, as we'll see. What is clear, and why I had to give you all that detail, is that we are in the heart of Rickman land here, where the emperor seeks innovative ways of rewarding those involved in order to shape the provision of the sustenance needed by the city population and increase its efficiency, but by suggestion and persuasion and incentive rather than by governmental fiat. The milieu affected by the emperor's measure, moreover, is clearly the freedman world of urban artisans and entrepreneurs. Indeed, the Latins who benefited from Trajan's incentivization are, one supposes, informally manumitted slaves of commercially minded owners, precisely the same group who may be reconstructed as the regales of the city of Formiae. However, what concerns me most this afternoon is neither of those fragmentary and difficult posts, but the next phrase, which describes a further employment of this successful freedman, and describes it in terms which this time are largely recoverable. Before the dedicators move on from the fonction of Eros to his happy role as the originator of a dynasty of town councillors in the next generation and Roman equites in the one after that. Quite apart from our assessment of the first few jobs listed then, here was a notably successful imperial freedman, whose descendants' rise through the status system is most naturally to be attributed to their progenitors' success, a success which no doubt had political and social components, but can hardly not have been based solidly on money. And the role that I am now discussing is numularius in aede Hercules Olivarii capturarum. That reconstruction seems to me to be beyond doubt, but very probably a word of further explanation to qualify capturarum is to be sought in the lacuna before the change of subject in line 8. Though we can't formally tell if the beginning of line 7 continued the recitation of functions or began the more domestic section, or if the former, whether there was more to the phrase, which included that epigraphically very unfamiliar word, capturarum, or a new short and probably abbreviated post of some kind. That there was something significant to squeeze in is suggested by the unrelaxed abbreviation of Irenaeus's name. Now, whether it was his most important employment or his least, his first or his latest, being a numularius, not usually a very grand kind of banker, involved in the world of Roman credit and the movement of substantial sums of money, but on the part of someone rather more like a money changer than the great men of the Roman credit system. And there's another surprise here too. Numularii are typically to be found fully in the private sphere. The phrase locating this man's service, moreover, at first sounds a bit like those retailers or artisans in Roman inscriptions who describe the place where they ply their trade topographically on their tombstones. But such a role would be out of place here. And our Formian freedman was doing something official in the temple of Hercules Olivarius. And we should emphasize that this was clearly the official location in which he was supposed to do what he was employed to do. It's not just a topographical reference point. So, what are capturae? What kind of a coin man was our hero? And how does all of this fit with what we know of the temple of Hercules Olivarius? First, captura, though it's scarcely attested epigraphically, there's one parallel, is a familiar enough word, and the example at 3c on the handout is pretty representative. The word means takings, of course, and takings in the sense of return or yield or profit, though it is, I would judge, a more colourless word than lucrum or its Greek equivalent kerdos. Next, official money changing, which is what numularius ought to mean. Taken as a whole, this inscription finds a quite close parallel in that dedicated to Publius Aelius Liberalis, which you'll find with a translation on the handout under 3. The inscription is dedicated by the officials of another locality by complete coincidence with strong BSR references, the settlement which Amanda Claridge has been researching over the years in the estate of Castelporziano, south of Ostia. Here is another successful imperial freedman, honoured by coastal city councils with a notable collection of rather hard-to-interpret duties, and a career actually rather more distinguished than that of our Formian, since it reaches the higher procuratorial levels and takes him into, admittedly rather modest reaches, of the gaudily self-important world of the apparitorial assistants of the Roman state magistracies. His most junior public appointment was being supervisor of the Ostian mensa numularia of the fiscus frumentarius. That link between the exchange of currency and the outgoings of the Roman grain supply is suggestive for the new inscription too. Shippers delivering grain and other materials to Rome from far-flung parts of the empire no doubt faced numerous issues connected with the exchange of local and imperial currency. So it might be tempting to say simply that our new text locates another exchange office of the grain fund, the Fiscus Frumentarius. Alongside the one at Ostia, there was of course one at Rome, and it was, we might discover on that view, in the temple of Hercules Olivarius. But there is that key extra word, and it's the word on which this whole paper revolves: capturarum. In the temple, something arose was doing something with takings or profits, presumably those of the kinds of people who frequented Formiae and Ostia, presumably those of the kinds of people who were engaged with the Fiscus Frumentarius, the kind of people who came from Africa, the kind of people who delivered the grain which the city of Rome so badly needed. Now, can what we know already about Hercules Olivarius shed any light on precisely what? Well, as I'm sure I don't need to emphasize to this audience, Hercules Olivarius is a rather notorious god. Let's begin with the topography, where this inscription offers a small but welcome new certainty. The regionary catalogues list at the east end of Regio 11, in the area of the Forum Boarium and the west end of the Circus Maximus, portam trigeminam Apollinem Caelispicem Herculem Olivarium. Now, of those three entities, Apollo looking at the sky was probably a public statue and has been taken to be a part of the spoils of Carthage from 146 BC. So there's been a strong suspicion that Hercules Olivarius was something of the same kind, a monument which likewise was still of some prominence in late antiquity. Otherwise, all we previously knew for certain concerned what appears to be a statue, the base of a statue signed by a known sculptor of the end of the 2nd century BC, Scopas Minor. This inscription is less help than one might think, given, I think this is on the handout, given the strange terminal O with which it begins. It's usually reconstructed as Hercules the Conqueror, who is popularly known as Olivarius, for which the Latin is Hercules Victor vulgo Olivarius. Well, I suppose that is just possible, and that's been a widely held view, but I'm pretty doubtful about it. It's a case of the pitfalls of Latinity of the wrong period. That use of vulgo is actually very hard to parallel for an ancient inscription. It's a late medieval and Renaissance usage, popularly known as vulgo, which is not well attested in antiquity. But maybe Hercules with some other epithet, cognomento Olivarius, might do the trick. Now, it was in 1988 that Filippo Coarelli, in his brilliant summary of what could then be known about the Forum Boarium, produced the parsimonious and radical theory that Hercules Olivarius was indeed a temple and not only a statue, and that it is none other than the marble tholos of probably the late 2nd century BC, which still stands in front of Santa Maria in Cosmedin. The missing link between the two was provided for Coarelli by a now well-known narrative which survives in two late antique versions, probably both deriving from Donatus's commentary on the Aeneid. You have one of the two under 5 on the handout. The version of Macrobius, who attributes it to an interesting and unusual source, Book 2 of the Memorabilia of Masurius Sabinus, the great Tiberian jurist. They concern, these stories, the remarkable successes of an individual called Marcus Octavius Herenus, who started life as a pipe player at sacred rites, gave it up and went in for mercatura, did extremely well, and offered his tithe to Hercules. Later, having another go at Mercatura, and beset by pirates, he fought them off vigorously. Hercules revealed to him in a dream that that victory was thanks to him, and Herenus this time, on getting safely into the Tiber, wheedled a plot of public land from the magistrates, and dedicated both a temple and a statue, idem sacravit et signum, with an inscription which is expressly mentioned, calling the god Victor, the conqueror. Now Coarelli took the epithet Olivarius to refer to the cargo of Herenus' successful venture, looking at the Eleopoli of Hellenistic Delos, the dealers in olive oil. And he dated the events to the open season for pirates, which was the later 2nd century, and he proposed the surviving temple as the monument, therefore, of buoyant Italian trade in the later Hellenistic boom. The ancient temple of Hercules Victor, now rebuilt as that of Hercules Victor with a new nickname, Hercules the oil seller. He even went so far as to identify Herenus as the tribune deposed by Tiberius Gracchus, who could be the same who proposed a counterattack on Gaius Gracchus's Lex Frumentaria a decade later. Almost immediately, almost before the printer's ink was dry on Il Foro Boario, Adam Jolkowski entered the lists. He denied that Hercules Olivarius was a temple at all, and he had a more telling argument to make about the round temple by the Tiber, namely that merchants and privati are not found rededicating Roman public temples. If the marble tholos is the temple of Hercules Victor, it cannot be that one built by Herenus. Circumstantially, he added that this precious piece of flamboyant marble architecture looks to be a work of far greater prestige, cost, and swagger than would be appropriate or possible for a seafaring merchant who had, after all, fought off the pirates in person in his single vessel. However lucky he was with the price its cargo fetched, whether it was oil or something more valuable. For Jolkowski, this is the temple of Hercules Victor, all right, but its rebuilder was none other than Lucius Mummius Archaicus, whose work on such a temple is attested on a rather crummy inscription which was found on the Celio. Here, then, would be not the fruit of Rome's economic revolution, but a high-end commemoration of one of the most pivotal wars in Rome's 2nd century history. That's the background, then. And it's into the middle of such a debate that the Formian inscription pops up. As you will have already noticed, the first thing is that it establishes at once that Coarelli was absolutely right about the temple. Now we know for certain that the cult place of Hercules Olivarius was indeed an Ides. Can we learn anything from the fact that it was one in which our imperial freedmen practiced some sort of financial responsibility? Do the contexts for Hercules Olivarius offered by the contemporary debate shed any light on what a numularius capturarum might be doing there? Now, I don't want to go too far into the details of the controversy I've just outlined very, very sketchily, and my argument does not depend on a particular solution to that problem, and anyway, coming clean, I thought it was perfectly possible that either Filippo or Adam, or both, would be in the audience, and I don't think either is. Am I right? No, I am right. Good. Makes me feel a lot better. On the one hand, I incline to Jolkowski's view that the round temple could not be a private dedication, and I'd very much like it to be Mummius's monumentum, but the architecture may be later than appropriate for that. Again, although Olivarius sounds tradey, the rapprochement of the two bodies of evidence doesn't, after all, seem to me to be so straightforward. Macrobius does very specifically say that Herenus' dedication was to Hercules Victor, and the story makes no sense otherwise, even if we can find a reconstruction for the Scopas minor inscription, which would confirm that Olivarius was a second epithet, a nickname, and that in itself is a strange item to enshrine in the label giving the name of the artist. It's puzzling that the Herenus story should make such a point of providing the precise etiology for and speak so precisely of the carving of the dedication to Hercules Victor in that case. And the story doesn't, after all, reveal what the ex-Tibicane was dealing in. The Latin for an oil trader already in Plautus is olearius. Olivarius should mean, if it's a trader at all, a retailer of olives. By no means so profitable a line. Might there be some other reason why this cult statue was called Olivarius? Could it have been the iconography of Hercules somehow? Was Scopas' statue Hercules victorious in that he was crowning himself with the first ever olive wreath of the Olympic Games? We are extremely close to the Circus Maximus, and the god of the Ara Maxima, as well as belonging to the Tiber river port and the ancient world of circumambient Hercules and Tyrio-Corinthian Melkart down the river, looks to the circus and the chariots and horses, past the cult place of Consus, the Roman Poseidon Hippios, to distant Elis. Here's another chain of connections, topographical and cultic, which is also very familiar to us all from Coarelli's work on the Forum Boarium. I'm also prone to doubt about the chronology. When did Herenus' story take place? If we remain agnostic about the link between the surviving round temple and the saga of the brave trader, the historical framework is wide open. Why does the Herenus tradition make such claims for the novelty of Octavius's cult title of Victor for Hercules? Is this just the carelessness of late antiquity, as the experts have on the whole concluded? But we might also wonder, why did Macrobius and Donatus behind him quote Masurius and not Varro on such a Varronian topic? Might the trading and the piracy be from the heyday of piracy in the 60s BC, and too recent, as well as perhaps too private in character, to attract the attention of the great polymath and expert on the foundation of Roman temples? Or should we even date it to the age of Pompeius's Cura Annoni? We know, after all, that Pompey, too, was among the great men who left their mark on the cultic landscape of Hercules in this part of the city. How Rakens does Rakens have to be in Masurius Sabinus's thought world? I prefer to be non-committal on the links between the various elements, though I can't resist noting that the official function of the Formian freedman in the temple of Hercules Olivarius perhaps makes it more likely that it's a properly public sanctuary. There's too much that we don't know. When Coarelli speaks of the carattere mercantile frumentario of the cult of Hercules, he says what is needed. Masurius' story demonstrates that traders were dedicating to Hercules long before Herenus' temple was built, which doesn't surprise, since there is indeed unusually abundant evidence for the religion of people who traded, in relation above all to this deity in the river harbour of Rome and in the Forum Boarium, a tradition which reaches right back into early Roman history. This religious complex, by its nature, involved many hundreds or thousands of private dedications and offerings, and constitutes a vanished ensemble between the tiny surviving glimpses of which we might hesitate to claim too strong connections. Now, this evidence for religion and traders centres on the practice which the Romans called the Tithe of Hercules, the Decima Herculis or Pars Herculanea, as it's called in Plautus, who mentions it several times. It provides both the old and the new titles of this lecture. That was the nature of Herenus' original offering whenever he made it. And in it, in making the tithe of Hercules, he alienated to the god the tithe on a captura. The pivot of my argument this evening, then, is that it's unlikely to be a coincidence that amid the deafening silence of Latin inscriptions on capturae, it's in the temple of Hercules Olivarius in the early 2nd century AD that we now have an attestation of an imperial official with clear links to the world of the traders who transported the grain which fed Rome, whose job involved the arrangements for somehow cashing precisely those kinds of takings. The Roman decuma, the Roman tithe, is a quite high-profile institution. We're now on section 5. You'll be relieved to hear. That's quite a long one. The Roman decuma is a quite high-profile institution, but it has perhaps not been interrogated as hard as it might have been. Given the evidence and the intriguingly early attestation of the practice. Hercules was the principal, though not the only recipient. Otherwise, the first thing to be clear about is that in this respect, what we see at Rome is something abundantly and very similarly attested right across the Mediterranean, from the Hebrew tradition, which I'll have occasion to mention again in a few minutes, or Greeks in the 6th century Aegean, to Gallic speakers in late Hellenistic Gaul. That range is, of course, exactly what we'd expect of parallels for the commercial facade of Rome, from Apollo Medicus below the Capitol to Diana on the Aventine, with the self-consciously Greek rites of the Ave Maxima of Hercules at the heart of the system. Indeed, in the recent posthumous work of Raymond Westbrook, Ex Oriente Lex, which I'm sorry didn't get into the bibliography, but it was published in Baltimore in 2015, the possibility of West Asian and specifically Phoenician origins for and influences on the Roman tithe is really interestingly presented. And that, of course, fits the nature of Roman Hercules extremely well. Now, the Greek practices which are so relevant to understanding the nature of the Roman decuma have been most helpfully elucidated by Theodora Jim in her recent monograph, Sharing with the Gods, a monograph which is useful for our purpose too, in that it reinstantiates at the center of our analysis the genuinely religious nature of the cultic relationships which are encoded in the cult of Hercules. So busy can we be with the economic aspect of tithes and the topography of the Forum Boarium as to forget that we are dealing with religious phenomena for which the parallels of the Greek and Hellenistic world illustrate the religiosity extremely clearly. That complex, which the documents and occasionally literary texts reveal, is familiar. Windfall is the common denominator. The never to be taken for granted and always to be appreciated success of the agriculturalist, the equally aleatory profits of the craftsman, artisan, or expert. Think of the rather wonderful St. Agatha axe head dedicated to Hero of the Plain in the ambit of Sybaris by Kyniskos, the dispatcher of sacrificial victims towards the end of the 6th century BC, dedicated as dekatan vergon, as the tithe of his labours, a famous example from this peninsula. But the more unexpected and accidental the gain, the more it was appropriate to dedicate some of it to the gods. There are two principal modalities, and they're both very relevant to my case this evening. The first is the precarious life of the seafaring merchant. Herodotus' account of Kolaios is, of course, the Locus Classicus. When Kolaios returned home, he dedicated to Hera of Samos a bronze krater of 6 talents in weight, which was the tithe of his profits, the decate epikardion in Herodotus' phrase. And so it goes. Aphrodite, in one inscription, makes Phaenos a great tradesman, a megas emporos, and he pays his first fruits to her. In 4th century BC, Phasaelis, a decata aponautilias, a tithe on navigation, is made to Athena, who protects the city. The Lindian Chronicle also claims several dedications of this distinctive type. Now, the second context, which emerges from the larger Mediterranean world, is at first sight rather different. It's the spoils of raiding, piracy, or war, such as the leas decater, the tenth, the tithe of spoils, of booty, which is offered in one inscription in archaic Didyma. Both of those widespread types of dedication feature in the Roman tradition too, together with a third which does not seem so easy to parallel elsewhere, which I'll come back to in a moment. There's a decent dossier of inscriptions recording private dedications made as a decuma, including one published quite recently from Tusculum. That text is probably of the 2nd century BC, which is indeed representative of the genre. I put a couple of these texts on the handout, both from, let us say, the middle of that century, which give us an idea of the language and associations of paying the tithe to Hercules outside Rome. That from Sora nicely illustrates the complex imagery of obligation and reciprocity, which is represented by the tithe. In that case, the Vertulei have seen their father's presumably financial fortunes restored against all expectation, and now, having made formal repayment, they pray for the continuing favour which will compel them to go on making comparable outlays to the god. The one from Reate in Sabinum is even richer. Here a banker, and one of a rather more ambitious practice than the word numularius would usually imply, has made money from usura, lending at interest. He emphasizes that his payment of his vow to Hercules the Conqueror is in accordance with ancient customs, and he too makes a bid for future favor. He begs the god to make the raising and disbursing of money easy, and he prays that the god will help him to make the tithe an accurate reflection of this financier's precise worth, a decuma verae rationis. Several further points should be made about the very interesting literary tradition about the decuma. Starting with the passage from Varro, from De Lingua Latina 6 on the handout. This introduces effectively the clear conceptual link between the tithe of Hercules and the world of merces, of goods traded. It presents the tithe as an offering of first fruits, and it also foregrounds the change in legal title to such goods which are part of their offering, and I'll return to that too in a moment. To be a merx, to be an object of trade, is obviously to be subject to changes of ownership. If the world of merces is to be represented in religious rites, then title and property will be part of what is put most clearly on display. The cult of Hercules of the Forum Boarium was then, as the sentiments of the inscriptions which I've just quoted show, in an important sense about who owned what and when. About what, if you like, was the biography of traded things, and how that biography contrasted with the destiny of what was returned in worship to the god. It constructs and displays a contrast between old wealth and new wealth, between private possession and the property of the god, an element which is impressively visible in the etiology of Herenus's cult, since his ownership and the god's share in it was specifically being challenged not by storm or sea, but by the threat of unjust alienation posed by robbers. Finally, we draw also from the Varro passage the invaluable detail that the rite which is longest attested at the Ara Maxima by inscriptions, the annual sacrifice of the urban praetor, which was still practiced at the end of pagan Rome, that it was about articulating just this sensibility. Now, a further very interesting aspect of the complex of ideas surrounding the decuma I can only treat more briefly. The dedication of tithes to Hercules of the Ara Maxima is closely associated with another distinctive category in Roman religion called polluctus. In brief, as you see from the passages under 5c on the handout, that's an aspect of sacrifice, offering, and dedication, which concerns the correct regulation of the consumption of what has been made over to the god. The Roman exegesis of these regulations emphasized once again the same kinds of question about where what was offered and consumed came from, and who benefited from the processes by which it was made available through a change of title to Roman consumers promiscuously, whether those processes were direct production by a benefactor or the result of a complex chain of retail and exchange. The whole supply chain, in the broadest sense of the phrase, was thus made visible in the religious rite, and a subject for concern and correct behavior. The decuma, as observed at the Ava Maxima, was thus clearly a rich, complex, and intrinsically ambiguous cultural practice, involving private wealth and public weal, the windfalls of citizens acting both for the community and for themselves. Since it clearly predated the adventure of Marcus Herenus, what can we say of its earlier history? That is to say, after its creation, long before Romulus, at the hands of the god Hercules himself, who sacrificed 1 in 10 of the cattle he recovered from the robber Cacus. And notice once again the same kind of play as in the story of Herenus. Hercules himself fought off a robber to get his property back. Herenus fought off the pirates to keep the property, which he then dedicates to Hercules. It's a carefully constructed tale. Now, the principal exhibit of this history is worthy of the claim I've just made about richness, complexity, and intrinsic ambiguousness. It is, and this is now section 6, the celebrated happening of 312 BC, when the 2 ancient gentes, and I had to get some gentes into this paper as a kind of valedictory to Christopher in his last Rickman lecture as director of the British School. And I've checked what he says about this in his book, and he doesn't say what I'm about to say here, I'm glad to say. The 2 ancient gentes of the Potiti and the Pinarii, to whom Hercules had entrusted his cult, were deprived of it by an action of the censor Appius Claudius, for whose sacrilege in so doing, said one potent strand of the antiquarian and historical tradition, he was struck blind by the action of the dishonoured hero, therefore becoming the great censor Appius Claudius Caecus. That is the version which survives in Livy, but there were other views. The one preserved in a helpfully complete section of the Breviarium of Festus emphasizes rather that Appius Claudius made the cult a public one, and henceforth it was administered by public slaves instead of members of the gens Pinaria and the gens Potitia. The great Appius Claudius authority, speaking of the étatisation of the rights of Hercules, was reminded of Cleisthenes of Athens, and most commentators have been interested mainly in the struggle at the end of the 4th century over the power of the ancient noble families in whose interest it was to control religion as well as to seek to dominate Roman politics. That's perfectly reasonable and undoubtedly part of the politics of the moment. William Harris in 2003 asked, when Appius, the patrician ally of the freedmen, brought about the nationalization, as he calls it, of the cult, was he looking after a cult which had a special meaning for merchants? Well, yes, of course he was, as you now know abundantly from what I've just told you this evening. But the analysis I've just made of the ideology of the decuma points us in a somewhat different direction, which has perhaps not been sufficiently considered. Was the usefulness of the returns of the tithe of Hercules to a res publica, which in this age was conspicuously managing new resources and undertaking new expensive projects, not an ingredient in Appius's plan? It's at least worth noticing, I believe, that he paid a very considerable compensation to the erstwhile priestly families, given as £50,000 of the bronze currency of Rome, on the cusp as it was of using its own money for the first time. According to the Lex Julia Papiria de Multarum Aestimatione of a century earlier, the exchange rate at which fines were assessed in the late 5th century was alleged to be 1 ox equals 10 sheep equals £100 of bronze. The price paid to the Potiti and Pinarii in 312 was thus alleged to be the equivalent of 5,000 sheep. That measure, irrespective of its historicity, concerned another dimension of Roman public life closely related to the calculus of tithes, that of public fines. In Greek thought about profit, kerdos, as Kotso demonstrated long ago, it was regularly the antitype of zermia, loss, which is also the normal word for a fine. Now I need to adduce briefly 3 further items, to 2 of which I've alluded before. The first is the synergy between booty and profit, visible in the evidence for tithes elsewhere, and a clear tradition at Rome too, on which Annalisa Marzano has recently published an interesting piece. She's particularly interested in the sharing of the Roman people in the spoils that had been made over to the gods, through a rapidly developing practice of triumphal feasting, which has clear links to the Tithe of Hercules and to the practice of Polluctus. It's a tradition which develops conspicuously when Romans most enthusiastically start to imitate Hellenistic magnificence in the 2nd century, but it's much older. Hercules can, after all, be shown to have played a key role in Roman theorizations of victory, and his epithets of unconquered and conqueror are usually associated with just the moment of the military successes of the cusp of the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. Again, who is entitled to use the windfall and how is the underlying theme. The second point is the idea that all private wealth might be seen as somehow windfall-like, precarious, suitable to be tithed for the gods, as well as for the consumption of the Roman people. Not unknown in the Greek milieu, where the orator Isaios speaks of making first fruits as if of your own private property for bronze and stone statues to adorn a sanctuary. Even stable family wealth could be called into question by Herculean imperatives. And Diodorus strangely says of Rome, I'm sorry, the reference isn't on the handout here, how Romans of great and moderate wealth often offer 1/10 of their possessions to Hercules, not spoils, not trade goods, but just of their possessions right off. The instances include, astonishingly, Sulla and Crassus. Now, the third point is to remind you of the close associations between sacred and public funds all round the ancient Mediterranean. Many of those personal narratives of success and reciprocity from my earlier section were one-offs, exceptional, unsystematic, individual. But the collection of the fruits of gratitude, gratitude to the gods, lent itself to being systematized too. Once again, there's plenty of Greek evidence, and the most relevant inscription to my argument is a diagraphe of the late 2nd century BC from the island of Kos, in which captains, sea captains and fishermen each pay per boat a first fruit of 5 drachmae per year to Aphrodite. The priestess gets a half, and the other half goes to the public bank for constructions and repair of sanctuary. In other words, the stakes were very high in this transaction from before the intervention of Appius Claudius, and they only got higher to the age of Sulla and Crassus. The quantities of wealth at stake, probably even before 312, were huge, and despite the ritual care with which the consumption of the decuma was ring-fenced, the systems for mobilizing the product of these offerings needed to be elaborate and to change with the times. It's time to move into concluding mode. I hope that you are beginning to intuit my hypothesis. The cult of Hercules tracked Roman economic history, and Roman fiscal history tracked it. In it, we can see the politics of regulating euergetism and managing the spoils of war. Here we see insights into the long and controverted history of public ownership. Here, in short, we see, as in so few other places, something of the rather mysterious development of Rome as a tax state, as a Steuerstaat, of the long history of its attitudes to taxation and the ever-incrementing process of the sophistication with which it carried it out. I think it then most likely that the role of accounting for capturae, fulfilled by something eros in the temple of Hercules Olivarius, involved accepting some of those profits, the profits made by the ship owners who brought the grain of the Annona to the Tiber, accepting some of those profits as tithes, tithes to Hercules, moribus antiquis, in the phrase used by the inscription of Sora. We gain a fuller sense of how the ancient practices of Roman religion could be brought to serve new purposes in the imperial city, and how, willing or not, comprehending or not, your guess is as good as mine, the shippers who were formerly engaged in Rome's supply of grain were also included in a web of obligations which reached more than 4 centuries back into Roman history. It's also tempting to fit this view into the question of the genesis of the Rickman compromise between private profit and public organization. There were many moments in that history, with Gaius Gracchus, Pompey, Augustus, and Claudius all playing roles. But a key one for shaping the ideology of the Annona is the Trajanic one, which was probably decisive in the life story of our man from Formiae. In that connection, I think it not a coincidence that the monuments of the Forum Boarium and Tiber harbour are so prominently depicted on Trajan's arch at Beneventum, that prime window for the ideological messages of the Optimus Princeps, where they have played a key role in the debates on the topography of their zone. One theme to emerge from this survey, then, is how matters as fundamental as the relationship of the state or the community to the affairs of individuals can be seen to have changed over the long time scale. It's perhaps not very surprising given what else altered over the centuries to which I've alluded, but historians of the Roman economy can sometimes give the impression that they are tracing a rather static set of behaviours which didn't significantly change. I hope to have explored a few themes this evening which might make us think further about what the character of the play of property and exchange in the objectives and practices of seaborne traders might have been. And instead of that steady state, we've been able to glimpse some important moments on which change was perhaps focused. I've proposed as one such the revolutionary phase of Roman history, which saw also the first major planned Roman landscapes of allotment, the first purpose-built and geographically innovative highways, and the first major investments in long-distance water supply. But the new inscription from Formiae reflects another transformative epoch, the phase from Nero to Antoninus Pius, in which, for a short time, Rome's imperial rulers saw themselves in a new kind of relationship to the world they ruled. Curiously, the age of the Alimenta, of the Curator Rei Publicae, of the Vine Edict, and the codification of the Edictum Perpetuum was at the same time as much of a pinnacle of achievement in the fields of landscape alteration, water supply, and road building as had been the age of Appius Claudius the Blind. In both eras, the relationship of the state and the decisions of the leaders of the community to the world we label economic, the redistribution of materials and the movement of foodstuffs above all, as well as the articulation of the superior status of the city of Rome, were the subjects of innovative intervention. In both moments of Roman history, as also in the ages of the destruction of Carthage and Corinth, and of Rome's decisive mastery of Mediterranean seaways, the mood and impact of change could be read in the place by the bank of the Tiber, where a god, taking the long way home to Greece with his reclaimed cattle, had first woven Rome into the communications of the world.